Good morning and welcome to the IT Professionalism Europe or ITPE webinar on responsibility in tech, ethical challenges for IT professionals. We have a great program with two experts in the field of professional ethics, and these are Carina Dantas of Shine to Europe and Clare Thornley at Clarity Research. But first, to set the stage and of this event, I'm pleased to introduce you to ITPE's President Declan Brady, who has been working with ethics in IT for several years. Declan, please, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's webinar. I have to say I'm particularly excited about the content of the webinar this morning. As Ronald says, I've been working in the ethics area for some time, not so much as a researcher, but more as a convener, and looking at the way in which IT professionals look at ethics and can use ethics in their work. There's a lot of different things, I think, that IT professionals need to grapple with from an ethical perspective. Such things as autonomous systems and safety critical systems and so on. But more practically, perhaps, how do we get the idea of ethics and the view that ethics is an important thing into the workplace in a day-to-day way? I think some of the biggest challenges that we have in this area are making the tools of ethics accessible to professionals on a day-to-day basis, so that people have confidence to be able to ask questions, to be able to bring up issues and challenges, to be able to talk about different sorts of thoughts that they might be having around the nature of their work, what's happening, what the consequences might be, whether or not the right questions have been asked, and so on. And really, that idea of bringing ethics into the workplace is what this morning is about.
We are thinking about ethics most connected to ethics requirements regarding data privacy, regarding the GDPR, etc. And this is very framed into big checklists where you need to understand if you are doing what you are supposed to do to comply with the law. But if we go to the classics, we understand that ethics is so much more than this, and possibly something that shouldn't be really only focused on legal requirements, but much more on how do you really do and live the best way possible. I'm pretty sure that most organizations will aim to have an ethical excellence implemented. But for this, they need to have the tools, which we hope to provide also with the framework, and they need to have a very clear pathway to do it and the workflow to do it inside the organization. And then, of course, to be sure that the teams are multidisciplinary and have the room and space to discuss ethics. And if they do, well, they will probably have a number of added value to implement it. On one side, of course, because they will have less risks in terms of legal consequences than others, but also because workers will feel more connected to the organization. They will probably be interested in being in an organization that promotes ethics and trusts, and of course, this will hopefully also increase the competitiveness of the product or service they are developing.
You say that a long-term strategy for ethics is crucial to have in organizations, but can you explain a bit more about how you manage this when the technology landscape and realities keep changing so fast around you? This technology has a really high pace of innovation today. So could you elaborate a bit on this?
Yeah, well, I think that as ethics can be seen soon enough, like a lot of other processes were seen in the organizations. Some years ago, you didn't discuss, for example, quality management or communication in the same way as you do now. Now you have dedicated teams and workflows and processes for some of these areas. So I do think that if we consider ethics in the same way, then for sure we will be able to implement it in place and to have different ways and workflows of doing it. The question is more that to do this, you need to have the organizations interested in it. And for communication or for quality management, for example, at a certain point, it was clear for a number of different organizations that this would be an added value, that it would add possibilities of profit, that would be an upgrade on the organization, and this is why it was implemented. So I think it's now our place, all of the people involved in this area and that understand that it is crucial, that we also push a little bit for it and try to find a way to pass this message of the added value of having ethics embedded in your organization.
So of course it's absolutely compulsory to start with 1984, which is the most famous book on imagining a world in which technology and information communication are used as an oppressive state. Though, again, George Orwell was writing about that to describe things that he thought were already going on. So that's also useful to remember. And again, we've just taken some of the main themes from these books that I'm sure are familiar to most of the audience, but just to remind people, maybe pull out some things that are a bit unexpected. I know when I read this again for this work, it hit me again in new ways, particularly this idea of controlling through fear, which I think we see a lot through the use of how social media is used, and also this simplified language, newspeak. So again, to go back to what Carina was saying, people actually, their brains have slowly been sort of diminished through the language they're allowed to use, so they actually literally cannot see the big picture anymore.
I think the great benefit of science fiction in this, as a tool, as a thought space, is that you can establish any rules that you want and let it play out. And it doesn't suffer from present fiction or past fiction in having to fit within a something where you just keep saying to yourself, no, that would never happen, or it's not real, or whatever it is. Once we put it into the science fiction space, then of course it can be real. So we're now free to explore what the implications and consequences of that are. And many authors, as Claire has pointed out, do that extremely well.
I think it provides a big safety net to be able to address some things that perhaps we wouldn't be addressing if we thought of real places and people. So this is for sure, I think, something that could be included in the daily management of ethical issues, because it makes you get out of your context and yourself and think about things in a different perspective. And this question of empathy and considering things from different angles than your own is possibly the cornerstone of ethics. Once you have empathy and you can think about things in this way, for sure you will consider ethical and societal challenges in a different way. So yeah, absolutely yes to everything.
Whistleblowers are heavily debated these days, and some defend themselves on, some are against these whistleblower rules and policies. But does your work foresee a special, almost systemic role for whistleblowers in our organizational ethical ecosystem? Claire.
I think I think whistleblowers are an important. We talked about the various different tools that we have to get better at this, and I think that's their one. Or sorry, not the people themselves, but the processes and the mechanisms to allow them to exist are important. But even if they're enabled, there's some, generally speaking, enormous social and career cost to people actually doing that. So I mean, whistleblowers, I think, are useful, and there should certainly be mechanisms in place. And I think we did talk of. I mentioned one use of fiction or stories could be to try and get people to notice if somebody had put their hand up there, would it have stopped? And I think this idea of don't be a bystander, be an upstander is generally shown to be moderately useful in stopping bad behaviour in other areas of life, such as bullying. So I think whistleblowing is important, but clearly it is kind of a nuclear option. I mean, it would have been far better if Facebook had had a process or a system for finding out all those. Well, it seems rather unfortunate they did know about it, but they weren't that bothered about it. So you'd like that to be different, I suppose. And if that can't be different, something needs to be done to make it different. But whistleblowers are one way of, just getting people to stop and think about what they're doing. And I think the public shaming, which generally is a bad thing, can be a good thing for these companies in that point of view. So I'll stop there and hear other viewpoints.
Just to continue with the whistleblowing, I mean, typically whistleblowing is a last resort, is it not? It is, you are at the end of the rope. Your career is now over as a result of that. And you imagine that makes people stop and think about whether or not this issue is so important and so on. So, I mean, what we really aspire to, I think, is something that's a little bit less extreme than that, where questions can be raised because people are happy to hear them and so on. And, I don't know if we'll ever get to that sort of a zone when ethics is often seen as something which inhibits or stops things happening and so on. But at least that's our aspiration, isn't it? That we can be open and easy about these questions and people don't think that they're stupid or that you're trying to impede, that you're trying to explore and see what makes possible.
Yeah, I think Declan just reached the core on that, which is it shouldn't be seen as something that will make people lose their time, discuss again, that will hinder something, but that can prevent something, which is for sure better and could even prevent whistleblowing at the end, because if it was discussed in advance, it would be much better. Yeah.
I mean, one thing that came up with some of our discussions on this paper and related work is that people tend to see being in a rush or doing things quickly as a morally neutral thing. Like, am I doing this project in 4 weeks or in 8 weeks? That is seen as an operational or a business decision, but it's fairly clear that cramming things into a very rough schedule has quite big ethical implications. It makes it much harder for people to stop and notice and have empathy. So I think that's an important thing to recognize. So Declan said, whistleblowing is a failure, really. It should have been stopped before. But how you plan your work can make it more or less likely that people will notice things as you're going along rather than waiting till the end.
So does that mean that we need a different role name or a different topic on that before it's in the stage of whistleblowing? And I was thinking of a sort of stewardship, a sort of steward on this topic, on ethics. Or do we need to put this into, and that's me as more of the technology savvy guy, is do we need to put this in the GRC side of the companies where governance, risk and compliance is managed, and should there be an E in GRC?
I've often thought about that as a question. What tends to happen when these roles get created is that the question now becomes their problem, that office's problem and so on. It's dealt with by them. We pass it over to them and something happens or it doesn't, but our responsibility ceases. So, I mean, on the one hand, yes, I can absolutely see the virtue from the idea that there is at least some part of the organization or process that has it responsible, but I also see the danger of abdication, right? These things and many more things that are in that suite of roles need to be owned more proactively by the people who are involved in the business than simply being over there.